All right, let's dive into one of the biggest questions in Christian theology. How does salvation actually work? We're going to explore two very different paths today, and each one gives us a profoundly different picture of God, of humanity, and of faith itself. Let's get right into it.
This whole thing really boils down to one powerful question. Is salvation this dramatic rescue mission where God does all the heavy lifting for a helpless humanity, or is it more of a partnership, a cooperative project where God offers grace and we have to choose to accept it? How you answer that is going to shape everything else we talk about.
So let's start with our first path, sovereign grace. In Chinese, you'd say that as 上帝主权的恩典,上帝主权的恩典. This view sees salvation as a mission where God is absolutely the primary and decisive actor.
So where does this path even begin? Well, it starts with a really stark diagnosis of the human condition. It doesn't see people as just spiritually sick or maybe a little lost. No, it describes the natural man as spiritually dead. And that means completely unable to understand spiritual things or please God without a direct, powerful act of divine intervention. And that idea is captured in this really powerful metaphor. If a heart is dead, it can't choose to take medicine. It can't cooperate. It needs something way more dramatic than that. It needs to be brought back to life. It requires resurrection.
This leads us to a really key concept on this path, irresistible grace, or in Chinese, 不可抗拒的恩典,不可抗拒的恩典. Now, this isn't what it might sound like. It's not about God dragging someone kicking and screaming into heaven. The idea is that it's a supernatural act where God literally resurrects that dead heart, changing it so fundamentally that the person now wants to come to him, willingly and freely. So the grace doesn't force the will, it actually transforms it.
Okay, so what about faith in all of this? Well, according to this view, faith isn't the action we perform to get saved. It's actually the result of being saved. Think about it. God first resurrects the heart, and that new living heart is then able to exercise the gift of faith. The sequence here is absolutely critical. Resurrection first, then faith.
All right, let's switch gears and look at our second path, which, as you'll see, paints a very different picture. This one is all about a cooperative will, or as you'd say it in Chinese, 合作的意志,合作的意志. Here, human choice becomes a really decisive factor.
The whole foundation of this second path is the concept of free will. This view really emphasizes that God, out of His grace, makes it possible for people to choose Him freely. So salvation is seen as this cooperative effort, a synergy between God's grace that gets the ball rolling and an individual's choice to accept it. That ability to choose is seen as just a vital part of what it means to be human.
The technical term for this is Synergism. In Chinese, it's 神人合作论,神人合作论. And it's just what it sounds like, a view where God provides the grace that's needed for salvation, but the final outcome really depends on a person's free will to cooperate with that grace. God does his part, and then the individual has to do theirs to complete the whole process.
But this is where a major criticism comes in. The argument against this cooperative model is that if the final deciding factor between heaven and hell is a human decision, well, then this system ultimately exalts the will of man above God. It kind of makes God's eternal plan dependent on what we choose.
And that critique leads to another pretty tricky question. Proponents of that first path, sovereign grace, argue that this cooperative view creates a kind of logical puzzle when you think about divine justice. Let's break that down. It's called the double payment paradox. Okay, let's just walk through the logic here. Step 1, Christ pays the complete debt for a person's sins on the cross. Step 2, that very same person ends up rejecting the offer and is sent to hell. Step 3. Now in hell, that person has to pay for their own sins. So here's the conclusion, and it's the crucial point. The debt for the exact same sins has now been paid for twice, once by Christ and a second time by the person. And the argument is that this creates a big problem for a perfectly just system.
So where do these two paths ultimately lead us? Well, maybe the most significant difference, the real-world impact, comes down to a believer's assurance of salvation. In Chinese, that word is 确据,确据. This table really lays out the differences side by side. Look at the sovereign grace model. Here, God actually saves people through a sovereign choice. He performs a resurrection. So your assurance is based on His unbreakable promises. Now look at the cooperative will model. Here, you could say God merely attempts to save by offering medicine. His choice is a reaction to a person's foreseen faith. And in this case, assurance is ultimately based on the stability of your own human will to keep cooperating. And that's really the bottom line from this perspective. The argument goes like this. If your salvation depends on your ongoing cooperation, then it's inherently insecure. Because if your will has the power to accept salvation, then it must logically also have the power to overpower the hand of God and lose it. And that, this analysis contends, leaves a believer with no hope, assurance, and guarantee.
Okay, wow, that was a lot. Let's pull this all together, do a quick summary, and I'll leave you with a few key questions to think about.
So we've got these two very distinct models. On one hand, the sovereign grace path, which sees salvation as a divine rescue mission. Assurance here is grounded in God's unstoppable power. On the other hand, you have the cooperative will path, which sees it as a joint project where assurance ultimately rests on the consistency of our human cooperation.
And that leaves us with some final things to chew on. How does your starting point, a dead heart versus a cooperating will, change absolutely everything that comes after? What do you make of that double payment paradox? Does it present a real challenge? And at the end of the day, what is the ultimate foundation for a believer's confidence? Does it rest on the unchanging character of God, or does it rest on the shifting sands of the human will?